So thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this Futures of Design Education with Luciana Scrutchen. Once again, it's fantastic to see people here. I think, as we were talking about earlier, I might have screwed up with the timing on this. I know it's a very bad timing in terms of academic workload in the States, certainly. So my apologies for that. I hope that you'll bear with us and stay awake to the end of the session. I'm sure you will, because Luciana's got some very interesting work to share with us. We're hoping for a much more discursive session here. So I'm glad that there's certain faces in the audience that I know definitely have opinions about things, which is always great. So hopefully we'll get onto that. Just before I hand over to Luciana, the next Futures is hopefully John. Are you still up for doing the next one, by the way, John? 17th of June? Excellent.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. And I think what John might do is share some of the practices that they developed at Manchester, sort of blended and hybrid modes during the last couple of years, looking at sort of digital and virtual spaces. So I'm hoping that that's still on the cards, John. Yep.
Absolutely. I've got myself and my other co-authors, two of us. Cool. So that's three already.
Brilliant, excellent. Okay, so that's the 17th of June. We'll get details of that around everybody just as soon as we possibly can. Anyway, today is Luciana Scrutchen. Luciana, I'm just going to hand over to you to introduce yourself, because I think your work is undoubtedly going to speak for itself. So please feel free and go for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining this kind of conversation today, or allowing me to speak with you all today. My name is Luciana Scrutchen. Design educator and associate dean, Parsons School of Fashion. I have an MFA in design and technology and a BFA in weaving and textile design. I have extensive experience working as a textile designer for many notable fashion brands. My past research investigates textiles and technology's role in subsistence cultures, focused on sustainable materials, new processes, and methodologies that support global health, which I present in the US, Europe, Asia, and the Dominican Republic. In our conversation today, I will discuss my continuing journey of decolonizing my design aesthetic by the process of unlearning in order to relearn, and how I was drawn to textiles because of my ancestry without ever having the benefit of knowing my heritage. So I'll speak a little bit for about 10 or so, 10, 15 minutes. I'm going to share a few images of my research. And I mentioned to Derek, I just set up some discussion prompts, but I'm happy to engage however we wish to engage in a conversation. Give me one moment to share the screen, please. Can everyone see my screen share?
Perfect, brilliant.
Okay, great, thanks. And I have a fan going, so if it gets a little staticky, please let me know and I'll turn it off. It's getting a little warm in the States here. North American Ingenity was the crux of my earlier research in Alaska from 2015 through 2020. I was investigating subsistence cultures from the past to the present to understand the issues with resources, commerce, and politics that shape remote communities, specifically that relate to textiles. Historical garments housed at the Anchorage Heritage Museum changed my idea of the Alaskan climate. I discovered that the vast expanse of the state is not strictly within the Arctic region, but rather contains several different climates and ecosystems. As a result, each area uses different methods and materials for clothing and textiles, applying a varied array of dye techniques, ornamental, and aesthetics. Oftentimes, the aesthetics and techniques are a result of readily available materials. Function necessitates form. Understanding the histories and practice of the indigenous communities in Alaska that exists on society's fringe was influential in my own craft making, scholarship, and teaching. In addition to the techniques learned, I witnessed sustainable practices that are mindful, efficient, and focused on environmental conservation. And I obtained a deeper understanding of the oppression of indigenous peoples who have endured a loss of resources, modernization, and their culture. While in Alaska, my field research took place in the Anchorage area, Juneau, Kodiak, Fairbanks, and Barrow, Alaska. I'm sorry, they're advancing a little bit. Come back here for a sec. Looking for relevance and application in American industry and culture, Alaskan subsistence cultures created a longing might connect with my hidden ancestry. And in doing so, gave me the ability to unpack the sociological and historical aspects of African-American women's subsistence ethos as it has been sustained and curated through dress in reaction to systemic barriers. And what may seem obvious is that I did not need to travel from New York City to Alaska to find a marginalized voice, but a conflation of events, including the pandemic, isolation, a hyper-focus of the Black Lives Matter movement, a contentious election in the States, an insurrection in the States, and an ancestry DNA kit that created a paradigm shift in my research, scholarship, and pedagogical approach that can be characterized as an evolution of sustainable, fashion-centric textile processes to something more personal, centering on social critique and cultural communication. To this end, I want to open up a conversation regarding the visual truth versus propaganda. Visual dishonesty can cause damage. It's nothing more than propaganda. And we can reference Black women's complicated relationship with fashion from mid-century through today, or my own experience as empirical evidence. Earlier in my professional practice, I strove to not frame myself as a Black stereotype by not idolizing tropes of impressions of what it meant to be Black and viewed through a white colonial lens. But I realized that I was wearing a cultural uniform, a uniform that expresses a particular social code, communicating that you belong in this environment. It is expedient to find your place in a group dynamic if you look like one of them. Passing for some Black women necessitated negating their beauty and voice, ingraining in the psyche of many Black women the need to acculturate colonialism in a systemic racist culture. Assimilation is a matter of survival. BIPOC people have damaged into believing the propaganda of visual dishonest images of beauty representing them when it did not. It's 2022 and fashion is just coming around to more truthful and diverse representations. Pedagogy, especially design education, has to include truthful cultural conversations, critical thinking, and comfortable spaces for all voices at the table to be heard. This requires a mindset shift that reaches far beyond a required one-day diversity and inclusion training situation or session. When thinking of visual honesty, I find effective communication is key. While every form of art seeks to express feelings, communicate a story, and connect with an audience, connection is found in universal truths, the emotional common ground that everyone experiences. Communication is about the story of these truths. So I chose to create my own story by finding ancestral practices that I am drawn to, just as I felt the need to create textiles at the start of my career. The more significant portion of my ancestral DNA comes from Africa's Gold Coast, areas around Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon, with peoples and cultures that were and are rich with art and textiles. While researching art practices in those areas, I came across funeral cloths called Antome and of the Akan people, worn by mourners and adorning the deceased, were stamped with Akan symbols called Ndinkra, stamped in a particular order, patterns, and colors. The Ndinkra symbols tell the story of an individual's family history and genealogy, creating a visual, expressive aesthetic that speaks to the truth of the person it adorns. I found this to be a refreshing idea. Could I advance this idea in American culture by creating a textile that illustrates universal truths, stories of families, love, pain, joy, life, and death? Looking at archaeological symbols of my multicultural past, I am the sum of all of my parts. I acknowledge the intersections of my Blackness, American, educator, textile artist, and designer inherent in me. As a professional textile designer, however, I felt constrained in the fashion industry within a tiny box that often didn't reflect my body, experience, or personality. Using artistic play as design research and exploring ancestral and Dinka symbols as a new language, I found it fitting to use the feminine practice of weaving as the medium of communication. Textile arts were female-centric occupation in indigenous and subsistence cultures and led the American economy during the Industrial Revolution. But African Americans were relegated to cotton fields rather than operating industrial looms. Reclaiming the art of weaving in my creative practice empowers me to recover my lost ancestral voice and visually communicate other historical disenfranchised voices in a meditative way that decolonizes and disrupts patriarchal monocultural thought. By weaving together an illustrated discourse that challenges the racial inequities in which we continue to be mired. I hope to open up sustainable empathy on our shared culture as individuals in order to reverse cultural political vitriol. Thus, I began working on Woven Story. This is one of the pieces from Woven Story. The use of cultural symbols without appropriation can be achieved by mediating the symbols, recontextualizing it in a contemporary culture. For example, the image sisterhood is a sample textile illustrating a Dinka symbol. The Duafe, the wooden cone, that represents positive aspects of womanhood. I've altered it by separating the handle section into its own graphic that can be read in contemporary American context as a top-down version of a head with outstretched arms, like so many computer games in some computer games images. Some unfamiliar with Indigenous symbology might be able to see that the empathy and strength of womanhood in the image of a person with outstretched arms. Color can also be contextualized with both ancestral and African and contemporary American meaning. Black is a symbol of mourning in both American and African cultures, but it also represents age, maturity, and masculinity, while blues represents having a blues or being down. In traditional African culture, it represents love, harmony, togetherness, and peace. The symbols and colors are imbued with layers of meaning and serve as a backdrop for a story my friend and collaborator wrote for the first panel of the Woven Story, entitled Collapse, an excerpt of which I will read now. Thousands of people crowded onto our property that day. There amongst the cacophony was a steady ramp of the auctioneer selling everything: old farm equipment, tools, buildings, and 40 acres of farmland, and the woods were on the block. I remember when they sold the woods. The auction was a huge party for my mom and her sisters, a cathartic unloading of material and emotional baggage. Everything went except the house, that pink and white two-story farmhouse, framed against the deepest blue of the sky at the end of the day. That house that held the worst memories, the house their mother died in, the house they heard her get beat up in. No, there was no one in the county that wanted that house. In this, the author uses color within a piece of great effect to illustrate the house of young women and the loss of their childhood in a dramatic way. I wanted to honor the colors of the house while also illustrating the feeling of loss and leaving a house shaped whole. Woven in a panel, excuse me, devoid of color that threads only with a small piece of pink glass dangling in a stained glass window. This is one representation of that. This is another representation of the story Collapse. Excuse me. My artistic aspiration of how to tell a multicultural story is only one aspect of making that infused into my pedagogical and creative practice. I challenge students to research and understand their own cultural representation, to claim some form of visual truth, whether cultural or personal. In doing so, I find capstone projects that often surprise and inform me as much as it helps students along their own journey. And here are a few more images from the project Woven Story. With my interest in visual honesty and bringing my truth and creative practice into the classroom, I saw the need to embrace a new cross-disciplinary curriculum. So I co-created a course with my colleague, Dr. Leanne Francis, Associate Professor from the College of New Jersey. The course is entitled African American Women's Subsistence and Blackness Through Dress, or in short, Blackness Through Dress. This is a critical pancultural multidisciplinary study within the new school. In the premier academic year, the student population included multiple degree programs, including 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees, and graduate studies across cross-disciplinary study areas, including liberal arts, creative publishing, critical journalism, fashion design, photography, and urban policy. Blackness Through Dress explores women's aesthetic practices and the ways in which these expressive practices are linked to political activism, historical ideology, institutional oppression, and Black women's resistance to it. In so doing, the course centers voices and experiences of vantage points of Black women across lines of sexuality, gender identity, color, complexion, and class. Very often, a Black woman's aesthetic curation is a political act. I found there is a thirst for Black narratives by our students of color for relatable course content that allows discussions about history and the impact of people of color in American culture. With less than 10% of enrollment of students that identifies BIPOC, specifically at the new school, I felt it was incumbent upon me to give any student of color in my class agency and a safe space to share stories without tokenizing their place in the conversation. Whether this requires including Black historical context in class conversations, additional course content, or introducing marginalized voices and hidden histories of design-centered tropes are all brought to light. While there has been a hyper-focus on solidarity within the context of the current societal and academic landscape of inclusive intersectional modalities, adjacent to this are the ingrained racist thinking, driving microaggressions and mass injustices that impact BIPOC identified students. The toxic legacy it bears provokes psychological distress, though at times invisible is ever present. Sensitivity and discourse around issues faced by BIPOC students are challenging to unpack in a somewhat emotionless environment, whether in person or in a virtual environment, especially when a BIPOC person is the minority. I chose to not restrict any topic or conversation that are politically inconvenient because we need to keep all avenues of communication open and honest. But questions still remain about how to mobilize inclusive, safe learning and model sustainable healing environments in order to foster a platform of BIPOC students to claim space, especially in design-based practices. And here is where I would like to begin our discussion. And I have a couple of a few questions prompt, but I'm certainly happy to open up discussion however anyone would like. So Derek, I'm not sure how, if we want to, do you want me to stop sharing screen or leave these up, or how you would like to proceed?
Yeah, I think if we leave them up for a little bit, let people maybe kind of digest them, and just thank you for that, Luciana. That was a really, really interesting insight. I mean, some of the things that really stood out to me were even just some of the phrases that you used round about that notion of sort of like visual truth, visual honesty, and the truth of the person and how that relates to universal truths. There's definitely something that made me think about that kind of relationship again. Yeah, so thank you very much for that, first of all, Luciana. Yeah, and we can maybe have a look at these questions and give people a couple of minutes maybe to just kind of digest them a little bit. I mean, in the meantime as well, if anybody else has any other questions they wanted to maybe direct to Luciana, would that be okay as well, Luciana?
Absolutely, yes.
That'd be okay.
Yes, cool. And yes, there's these two, yes. Any question for me? And I'll just pop together two for a sec too. And if there's any, these are the other two I just put up. Yes, I'm open. Any questions or I'm happy to engage.
Cool, excellent. Because yeah, I think that second question, that's definitely going to be one I'll be very interested in hearing a bit more about. That it's really made me think about that notion of truth, the truth of the person, or the. I mean, I'd love to hear a bit more actually about that, what your feeling or thinking is round about visual truth or visual honesty. But I don't want to hog the conversation either. So please, if anybody else has any questions for Luciana, Oh yeah, and Leslie Ann's making a suggestion, Luciana. I don't know if, are you able to sort of copy the text?
Oh, sure, of course.
Would that be possible? Sorry,
Yes.
no, that'd be brilliant as well. Yeah, and does it, if anybody has any questions for Luciana just on the material that she's presented, or then please feel free to just jump on the mic. Feel free to come in.
I will copy them in the chat. Sure, just give me one moment, please.
Oh, sorry, Morgan. My apologies, I was muted. Morgan, please.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much, Luciana. That was really wonderful, and just the textiles that you showed were breathtaking. I was wondering, in terms of sort of the research, how did you find the conversations were when you were gathering the research and creating these textiles and objects, and then in presenting them, do you find there's sort of overlap in the ways that people discuss the research when it's sort of in a research context versus when it's in sort of this object context where people are able to actually see it and sort of gain that different multisensory approach?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I found, depending on the how I'm engaging with the individuals, it has been different. I found that given the context of where one's I would say tolerance is with being careful with engaging in the conversations, it has been a little easier to engage when coming from a prospect of showing like a tangible object or prospect of the project, something where maybe a tactile material without understanding what the context of it was more accessible before getting into in conversations. I sometimes feel that there are some who are careful with engaging in a certain way, whether or not, or how they may engage in a certain way. I think, and it's part of what I want to talk about today is I feel sometimes when a conversations in the climate around is always seems charged, at least for certain people who are in those spaces. And for some people, perhaps their daily lives, they may not be experiencing something charged, or may not have the feeling that they always need to have a different persona or face when they're showing up in a situation. They can be comfortable possibly in several situations. But for those who are not, different levels of engagement, I've had to either start with an object, talk about just what objects are, what the connection of textiles and materials are, maybe ask someone to reach back to how they connect with materials or textiles, whether or not they are design, if they identify as a design center, person. And for some, just maybe approaching it by the cultural landscape of what's happening, political landscape what's happening. But I tend to tread careful depending on who I'm engaging with. So not to talk in a circle, but it does really depend on, how I'm engaging someone with it, because I want there to be, I don't want to start a conversation with this work to be contentious, right? I respect different opinions, that people have different lived experiences. I respect that we all have different people who are in our group. And I don't propose to assume that anyone who doesn't share my identities or my intersections, do not have anybody in their lives that also share that, they don't know these other stories. Nor do I expect someone who possibly doesn't really have one in their close circle who shares my intersections would have access to understand, other than whatever their media outlets is, to what's possibly happening in these different spaces. So I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, Morgan. It's just.
No, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Nicole, yeah, please go for it.
Hi, I'm Luciana. Sorry, there's some noises around. Apologies on that. Very fascinating. I feel so sorry that my PhD student in the Ahmed can't be here, because I think you have loads and loads of connections. She's just finishing up her thesis, and I do think loads of the stuff you found is totally mirrored in her work as well, around fashion and decolonization of the education within that, especially building on personal narratives and experiences and how to build that. So one of her findings things, and I'd like to test with you if you found a similar thing, is the use of kind of Western normalized techniques such as the sketchbook or mannequins for, you know, draping kind of fashion around bodies that are normative white, certain, you know, sizes. I was wondering if you found a similar thing around these techniques or technologies used within your work as well.
Yes, which is why in the pieces or threads of work, I often mention reclaiming, because there is this very continues to be this very normalized approach, and especially some of the root of what I've been, you know, been studying is with subsistence cultures and cultures where one didn't have, where the body in a form doesn't necessarily start with a size 0, so to speak. It doesn't have a particular type of what a Western idea is of body type or shape. So when I've been researching, it's a different, I found that it's a different way of for cultures that have felt marginalized for different aspects, whether or not it's marginalization by body type or aesthetic. The way in which they are presenting themselves, the way in which they reach back in appreciation of the body itself is vastly different. I often find that those conversations and those connections are often shared from a cultural aspect, and what is normative in no space is quite different than if I'm engaging in a Western space where one may have the same type of stories or may type of stories or engagement, but what is often more so adopted is what has the societal messaging has been more so adopted of what one's presence should be or what one's persona should be.
Can I follow up with one
Sure,
question?
absolutely.
It's all right. Something else, basically based on Tanvir's work, which is the question that arose that without being as a, you know, a Black feminist scholar in the classroom, kind of leading discussions that involve your lived experiences and trying through that, involving students in drawing on their own lived experiences of diversity, ethnicity, disability, for example. How can an educator, another educator that might not have the same experiences, how can they somehow also use these kind of strategies without having those lived experiences? That's quite. Do you know what I mean? It's like you cannot take the educator outside of the equation of education, so to say. And I'm wondering how you feel about it, if you know any strategies, or if you think that's just impossible, or yeah, just one thing I wanted to ask.
Right. I do not think it's impossible, but it definitely goes back to your first question in the context of education in the class. It is because if you are a person that may not share the identities of the students who are presenting this work, or if someone wants to have these conversations within the context of their class, from an educational standpoint. And this is coming from myself and also students that I've mentored in class space that have been, I would recommend at least doing a check-in with before one wants to start to engage in a content in a class, depending on what the topics are, but they're situated in this space. I would maybe do a check-in. How's everyone doing? What is everyone's comfort level of engaging in these conversations? Does anyone have histories with this specific topic that one is going to be you know, speaking about that may seem charged and may seem triggering? I would, that's from an educator perspective, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think when I say the check-in should be acknowledgement that the peers in that class should also feel comfortable with each other. So there may need to be some rules of engagement, depends on the level of the class, right? If it's one person one person in that class that might identify as a person of color, BIPOC, whichever how they identify, and they're in a class where maybe people do not share that identity with them, you want, most people who want a discourse around this, they want everyone, they want teaching, we want teaching, learning, and shareable moments, right? We do want space for our own selves as well to have these conversations amongst ourselves, but we know there's nowhere to move forward if it's only isolated conversation. But we also want to be careful that we want safe for people, that there's people are cognitive of what somebody might be experiencing in a space, being the only person of, or where their everyday lived experiences coming to the space, whether if they're marginalized background, what they may be carrying to bear within the context of the classroom, where so a faculty can lead a discussion at where have knowledge or set or whether community engagements or I'm saying rules of engagement, but I really mean community engagement as well. But I think there may need to be maybe discussions beginning of the class to talk about, we'll be getting into this, this territory. This is how I wish to engage. You may want to have the students who whichever side of the fence they're on, if something is triggering, maybe part of the rules of engagement is discussing at what level does one address either calling someone in or calling someone out if someone feels like they cross line, or how do you you want these discourse to be active in the context of the class, but you also want to make sure that no one walks away feeling hurt. And sometimes it's difficult. It's just going to be, sometimes the conversation is just difficult. There's no way to control it either way. I've been in classes, my own classes, a class I've taught, or classes I've sat in on, of also different peer groups where there are allies there that may not, and the people within the context of the class or conversation may not know that they are an ally of, and that person being an ally and being aligned with these different contexts, these conversations, know not to raise their hand to say I'm an ally, or know not to raise their hand and say, well, I have a friend of this, I have a friend of that. But they often want to try to find a segue into the conversation. I've had folks in my class that have held off asking questions, and let's say if obviously if it's Zoom environment, it's a little bit slightly different because one can do, send you a private chat to say, I want to engage, but I don't want to take up space. One could, set the ground rules that everyone has opportunity to speak, and if somebody who's not had opportunity to speak, who's not had opportunity to speak, to give them opportunity, or somebody who maybe identify as a person that's of a marginalized group, the conversation is centered around that, provide time for that person to possibly speak, or set limits on talking conversations or talking points. It's quite different depending on the level of engagement. And I will say, I know, and I said this, I know I talked about the student critique. What is still challenging from what my consultation with students of color, it's still conversations oftentimes with their peers. So while the faculty are cognizant, while there may be course materials or whichever approach to support one's learning, the one-on-one conversations, the tutoring, the mentorship is in place, they still find it hard to get up and deliver a presentation in class where they have to always preamble, preface, a context of how they're presenting their work before they can get into their project. So often they feel that there's time taken away from them because they have to educate before they can deliver. So that just possibly balancing that as well, depending on the scope of the class or what the conversations are going to be centered around.
Yeah, I was going to have a bit of a question about the balancing question, but I'll let Leslie Ann go first.
I just wondered if you've had any negative reaction to this kind of pedagogy. I mean, either from the students of color or the students who might be perceived as a dominant group.
Yes, and it depends. So within without the new school, since we have such we have a small percentage of people that identify as BIPOC, when most of the time they're rarely in classes of people who identify in their same group. So in my teaching, and when I've been in those spaces, there has been charged conversations. There has been students where they feel as though it's their time to speak as frankly, as bluntly as they can speak, and they feel that others in the class who may not identify as them sometimes take up too much space, with comments or commentary, not understanding. And again, it goes back into students feel like they have to keep explaining or re-explain. There are in that case, it is. So I've been in those classes, and I it's been okay for me to balance out some of the situations. Again, not always, but most of the time. However, I've had faculty who identify as white be in the same situation, and the situation in class has elevated. There's been times where we sent communication, being careful craft of communication to the whole class, not to call anyone out, but to make sure there's an understanding of what's happening in the space. So yes, the conversations have with this context, it's often quite charged. There are times where there's subject matter, if I'm speaking about certain topics, especially in the context of the Black through dress class, when if it's a mix, a class, if the students in the class are of mixed race, even if the dominant class may be a minority, maybe brown people, when it comes to such topics such as colorism, I handle those classes very differently. I will either do them offline or give people time to focus and come back to the group, or different ways to communicate. So don't want to set up a stage where let's say in the context of this conversation, where there's colorism and there's many brown faces of different, the people in this space have all experienced it. Whether a deeper brown person, a lighter brown person, a person with more naturally, appearing features. So it's charged within itself. So when it comes to intercultural conversations, I've also approached it slightly different in my own class. And again, in other classes, it has been charged in other faculty and students. It comes up often. And sometimes it takes time just to recenter the group and really get at the context. We want to have these dialogues so we can share and be open. So it's, and sometimes there needs to be a separation, a little bit more us engagement to sort of mediate what's possibly happening across the discourse. But I think I don't want to take. I just wanted to just.
Oh, please go for it, Luciana.
Okay, I just want to just say what is often compounded in my own teaching experience, was often compounded is not, while the students who are signed up for a class with this content, whether or not they share, again, if it's they share their identities or they're coming from a marginalized group, the hope, the aims are hope that someone's in this class because they want to engage in these types of courses, because they want to engage, right? They want to learn, they want to engage. That is a hope. But I still think when it comes to college, in the academy, most students aren't necessarily focused on what's happening out media, so to speak. Not that they don't know what's happening in the world. So they may not know that a person, whether so they're in this class to engage, they may not know, let's say the shootings, the killings just in Buffalo, New York, in the United States. They may not know that a student in their class is from that, is from that region. So while they're coming to class with this, they have yet another weight to bear in this class. We're talking about heavy content already, and they are actually, coming to class and living it. So while there is a sensitivity to it for some people who are coming to the class, they still may not understand, again, the everyday experience of their peers and how it can shift at any point in the day, especially when they're targets and when they always feel to be target, or that student, their peer in that class, while there's level of engagement in that class, that person has 7 other classes where no one in that class looks like them, where they're still on performance and they're still performing, so that their daily presence on, whether at the academy, in spaces at the academy, again, this is mostly for those who are being educated at spaces where they are not the majority, majority. So just the everyday lived experience is often sometimes lost. And the students of color, they feel that impact. They feel it in their social spaces. They feel it in their practice making space. They feel the constant need to be on, right? And not have enough time to take their own space, and feel that there's an inequity and disadvantage because they have so much emotional time to kind of get their souls going, where some of their peers may not have the same type of emotional experience. Not to say that people who are not marginalized do not have emotional experiences, but the students always feel again, disenfranchised, or that there's unbalance, there's a disadvantage, because they still have to present and still meet the same bar as their peers. I would say especially, well, I would say in particular when it comes to design-based education, where studio time and practice, and that where so much time is involved in the making and craft, you don't get that time back, right? You don't get, you need time to practice, you need time to explore, you need time to investigate. And when so many things are heavily weighed, you don't get it back. Or if you spend all of this time designing and developing and researching as a practitioner or a student, and you present your work and it's met with aggression, to start over, to think you may need to start over, to question yourself. If you feel like you need to question, if you feel like you need to question your work, it's also disheartening for them. So many students, often feel depleted as well, just because of the time spent, and how they feel that they're met with, either in a school space, going on internships, whatever it is, when it comes to design-based practice, especially if that practice is centered around these types of contexts and discourse, right? Where it's uncomfortable, especially often feel a certain level of pain and hurt.
Yep. So I'm wondering, Luciana, would it be possible to pick that first question? I'm wondering whether we could maybe pop that one up, because it strikes me, what you're saying, there is something important here, not just as a general education thing, not just a general socio-political thing, but something specific to design education with respect to the time that we know is necessary to engage in experiential learning, to develop an individual identity as a designer, and so on and so forth. All of that stuff that goes into the paying attention to the longitudinal experience of being a designer. If there's a whole bunch of other work, emotional labor, identity labor, even making up for the communication of, or the failure of parity, if you like, in the definitions of that, that's taking up a whole bunch of curriculum, if you want to think of it, that nobody is recognizing just now, or potentially very few sort of curricula are actually recognizing. And it goes beyond things. This isn't about representation or just giving examples. This is actually about allowing. It strikes me that there's a big, massive still imbalance. And I guess my loaded question might be, is there still, between this kind of like universal truth and the truths of persons, the truths of individuals, the stories of individuals, I still wonder whether there's this backstop inequity roundabout certain cultures and traditions that don't even recognize that and will never recognize that. And then certain traditions that are aware and at least ready to listen to that, if you see what I mean. And that kind of hard backstop, and you can see it in certain cultural spaces. It must be one of the biggest challenges that you face as an educator in that sort of space. It's a massively social political challenge. How do you engage with those that do not give a about wanting to engage, in fact, have a vested interest in repressing that engagement? So I guess the question is there a fundamental like backstop or limit to what we can do because of that sort of persistent, if you like, imbalance? And second of all, I suppose it would be more of a pragmatic one that might touch on the kind of individual questions that you were wanting to pose. I'd be to open this out to the group and to ask whether or not others have other like mechanisms or tools for approaching that issue, if indeed they do have any or have been aware of it. I don't know if that question makes any sense. Or
I just put in the chat Luciana's work. Well, obviously we don't know all of your work in 2 minutes, but I was really struck by that idea of using an object or artifact to start the conversation about racism and I, to start these conversations. And I remembered David Pilgrim, who is a professor at Ferris University. He actually has a museum of racist objects, like the kind of like mommy figures, and and he's using that to start conversations about racism. And I think that that's really Luciana, you said something really interesting. I didn't write it down, but it was like using this 3-dimensional thing to get people to talk about things that are a little bit more difficult to talk about. And I think that is something that we can talk about more in design, how we're using this kind of embodied approach to talking about race or social justice, or, you know, these kinds of topics. So not a question, not a, just opening for another comment on top of it.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for that. As a matter of fact, the comment about Jim Crow, for the beginning, the one class that I teach, for the beginning 3 weeks of the class, I do prompt with Jim Crow. Well, I start with images from the earlier slavery area and onward to Jim Crow for the first 3 weeks, just to situate everyone in the class to understand what has the impact been, and for certain objects like the Jim Crow, where it may just look like figurines to some, even some, regards to it may look like figurines, that these tropes mean something, and these are rooted and these have carried forward. So yes, and those types of images, especially those types of objects, especially to, I would say, the generation now that are maybe the undergrad generation now, where they possibly maybe not, have seen these types of things, or maybe they more so place them as caricatures and not understanding what this caricature means, and that this meant something, especially when it comes to the Blackness and Blackness culture, the physique of people. Nicole, you mentioned about the one PhD student, the roundness, the jolliness. What does that mean in a physique? Is that, stylish versus the narrow, thin, more demure, physique, and how those particular, imagery has manifest with respects to just clothes and physique, but what that characterization actually means, and how it is still embodies still how media portrays Blackness, people, culture, still the jolly, happy, and so all of those things, they're all resonant of it's rooted somewhere. It's rooted, we know it's rooted somewhere, but for students to understand how it's rooted somewhere and understand that, and if they're in their own design work, in their own work, whether it is somebody who's in marginalized space or somebody who is not, and they present these types of images to have an understanding what these actually mean. What does this characterization mean? What it may seem like an animation, drawing, or a sketch in a book, this might mean something, to take a step back to think about where these tropes possibly come from. So I know it wasn't a question, but thank you for that. But it does objects like that, but also other three-dimensional objects, they do certainly help provoke the conversation. Sorry.
Yeah, Morgan, go for it.
Yeah, that makes me think of I just graduated from being a student and I'm starting teaching. But as a student, one of the things that I found challenging about design is that it's so rooted in the now, and it feels very hard, or it was hard for me to find access to history and access to like futures that are more pluralistic, because it's usually just the one future. But I think that's something that I'm interested in how like getting ourselves out of just the constant now can help get us to have more nuanced and better conversations in the classroom, rather than, like, if we're just constantly in the present, it's hard to see changes and imagine new changes. Yeah.
And also, maybe just to build on that, and again, I suppose it's one of the kind of dreams of why we're doing this sort of futures plural of design education. It's recognizing the fact that most of the time we are talking about present, singular. And if we talk about presence, as you're suggesting almost, Luciana, it's almost like, what are the truths plural of the people in this space? That might be an alternative as well, Morgan, I don't know. Even just accepting that, if we are constantly just obsessed with the present, then could we at least pluralize that, and then maybe make that might give you different paths to future if that was a way. Well, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, Luciana, or Byron, did you want to? Sorry, Luciana, on you go. Sorry.
No, I was agreeing. It's I think it's a challenge to while design, right, while design is, it's not necessarily an answer question, or well, not that it necessarily was a question, not that the question was a question, but I think it's hard. Yes, design is in the present, and we're looking at the future, but it's a challenge to, I think, for some, for what's happening in the present, to not have what the past inform what's happening in the present, and to not feel exhausted by the present to move forward to the future. So while there's an optimism there, I still feel that the present can be very exhausting for some, right? And it's, you know, it's almost as if it's almost as if we're in a constant stagnant state, right? So we're just charged to move forward. If some of the social political issues are repetitive, or keep resurfacing, you feel like you cannot move on, right? You need to stop and address before moving on. Or if we're looking at design futures, or design education, or practitioner designs moving forward, we feel as though, how can we get there if we haven't settled this present space? You know, we already know what's been hurtful in the past. So the present should be informed by the past for us to move forward, but it doesn't seem to happen, right? You constantly feel like there needs to be a recorrecting, you know, a redirection before you can kind of hopefully move forward. So it's not really an answer, but it's you know, for some, you feel like you're constantly in this space, right, of recorrecting, you know, in order to be able to shift the mindset.
That's quite a powerful reminder again of, yeah. Okay, Byron, I'm going to come to you.
Hi, thanks so much for that. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm actually based in Cape Town in South Africa, and we almost have an inverse relationship in many ways with the US, and especially recent developments. I've noticed the word Indigenous has gained a lot of traction in the last 10 years. And it wasn't that long ago in South Africa that it was almost considered derogatory to use the term Indigenous, which really goes back to the colonial project and trying to put the term Native as something which is actually below the power balance. But it's being used a lot in South Africa now for transgenerational studies in design, trying to get back to previous cultures, and if that's due to apartheid, but also due to things where we had AIDS denialism at some point, and you had grandparents bringing up children. So you had this very interesting link between Indigenous knowledge. But I think the one difference I've picked up in the presentation is that Indigenous in South Africa tends to actually have a very positive connotation. It's about reclaiming the past, reclaiming knowledge, specifically with things like medication, social systems. But I noticed in your presentation, you often spoke about Indigenous and marginalized almost interchangeably. How do you actually define the term when you introduce it to a class? How do you actually introduce it? It is a political and highly charged term, but how do you position this as something that is actually constructive and positive?
The Indigenous or the as
Indigenous.
Yeah. In aspects of first peoples, native and first peoples, native from an aspect of being the originators, depending on the context, if I'm talking materiality or text of the owners of a certain knowledge, the owners of certain ways of being, ways of making, ways of knowing, right? And I speak to reclaim in that context as well. When it comes to that's how I frame Indigenous and what it means to be Indigenous. It depends on the landscape of where we're talking about Indigenous being, but really it is about the people, first people's knowledge, ownership, a practice, ownership of being able to not have, in context of appropriation as well, shared and borrowed. When it comes to marginalization, it's a little bit broader because obviously different groups can be marginalized, not just indigenous groups, but when one is occupying those several different intersections, and they are people who identify as that have often felt the most disparity.
Yeah.
And it's so I know you mentioned that when it comes to, I believe you mentioned in South Africa that if I understood it right, that would the framing of indigenous is you mentioned is empowering, right? Is that, I'm sorry, I don't want to rephrase, but right. So
Yes.
okay, right. So I'm not, so the space that I occupy with that word is in the same context, right? Because there are people often, again, in context of design, textiles, and fashion, we know what ideas come from borrowing from cultures, right? Or from education, or from education of learning something from a particular space, or borrowing from a particular space, and either have ownership of it, or saying that one wants to go to these spaces and uplift or empower, right? Uplift, power, transform, those spaces, when it may be the other way around, when it should possibly be the other way around, right? Learn from what those teaching systems were, learn from what those modalities were from those specific spaces. And I do also in my work reference subsistence quite a bit from Alaska and also from the African culture, and I understand that in generationally, subsistence is supported within those indigenous communities, but the other generations also reference as thrive. They didn't just sustain, they're thriving. So it does depend on the context of which we're introducing a concept. I'm introducing a concept of how we are all in a class speaking about, and how students who identify as an indigenous identity, how they're also positioning their voice in their work as well.
Excellent. Very interesting. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Byron, and thank you for that, Luciana. I'm conscious of the fact that we're coming close to the hour. I did have a boring, pragmatic question to maybe ask Luciana. There was a point, I think one of the slides that you presented talked about digital textiles. And again, previously or prior to that, you had been talking about if you like, the truth that can come through actual physical made objects, material objects. I just wondered, is there anything, or could you give us a bit more of an example about what that digital textile might be, just in terms of what it is, either materially, and how does that relate to, material thing that might act as an artifact that might negotiate or initiate these kinds of discussions? Have you had any experience with working in sort of distributed environments, online environments, or different spaces other than that kind of face-to-face experience? And do you have any sort of different inflections on materiality?
Materiality in the context of working in a digital environment versus a studio environment?
Yes. Yep.
My own practice or teaching? Because, well, I mean, how? Because I've taught. Okay, so I'll just frame it this way.
Any of the above.
Yeah,
okay.
Okay. Because I've taught as a textile maker and educator. I have taught pedagogy before the pandemic online for probably 10 plus years, textile based work, as well as in the studio space. And it has had challenges with respects to the materiality aspects with the understanding of how people in this, not understanding actual tools to create a digital, to create conceptual or designs, but really how people connect to these materials in a specific space. That has been a challenge. And with that kind of studio-based tactile course online, and it is, and I often would have students approach doing whatever field research in their own with their own demographic of what they're in, but also try to understand the different sensories of textiles and making, how people relate to materials, what materials mean to them, whether it is from a cultural aspect, what materials may mean, whether from within the context of whatever which they reside or their lived experience, or what it would mean to give one actual curation or being or out, when it's maybe not so subliminal when it comes to materials, to try to connect them in that space. And then there is the color so there's a fiber structure, there's a color, then there's a making of it. When it comes to, I know we're kind of running out. I know we're running over time. I'm not sure if I quite answered your question, but I've talked about this before, because I've had different ways of trying to engage in the space of creating a 3D tactile studio-based class, not creating, but really having one understands what materials are, what textiles are, what that making is, what the construct of materials are when you are in more of a virtual environment versus an in-person. There's still challenges in person as well. Obviously within studio-based making class and fibers class, different ways in person, but there's still challenges and opportunities, I should say, in teaching approaches.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Luciana. Sorry, that was probably my fault for.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
bad question. Yeah. It'd be good to connect it back to the. Sorry, yeah. Sorry.
I would say, but the work within the research that I presented here, those. So I gather the narratives from individuals, and that is me storytelling. I do different types of patterning to create different types of images. Different ways weave structure yarn. So the colors and threads do mean so I didn't do a deep dive into the context of this conversation, but I will then create those as tactile. But I am looking at imagery, doing composition of materials, shifting textile related patterns and motifs and dobbies in those woven structures before the actual making process of it. And my own research, my own practice outside of the teaching pedagogy.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'm conscious of the fact that, as you said, we're 2 minutes over. I'm so sorry for that, Luciana. But it was a really interesting sort of presentation and discussion. I know I've definitely got several big things to think about over the next few weeks, maybe months and years. As we look forward to our kind of new curriculum here in the UK, it's definitely given me something to think about with respect to that. So I can only thank you so much for that, Luciana. And yeah, I think from everybody else, thank you very much for your time and for the presentation, for some very thought-provoking ideas. It'd be good to continue the conversation somehow. We need to get better at continuing the conversation after these events. We'll need to think about that one, team, by the way. Just a quick reminder again, John Spruce on the 17th of June, we're looking at some sort of hybrid and digital spaces that they created at Manchester during the pandemic. But if you could join me just now in thanking Luciana, thank you so much for that. It was greatly appreciated. Thank you everyone. Definitely gave us something to think about. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for coming along as well and contributing. It was greatly appreciated. Thank you. Bye-bye.